Doing possession type horror is hard, especially when so many films have done it so well and so uniquely over the years. Even Talk to Me this year gave a fresh perspective on the possession subgenre. But when Evil Lurks is not only possession horror done well, but gore done well, horror storytelling done well. It's been getting quite a bit of buzz online, and that's always exciting for a horror because it isn't a genre that gets a lot of universal praise, especially foreign horror. Now admittedly, a lot of films become popular just for the sake of being foreign movies that everyone seemingly is enjoying, and if it weren't for the fact that they are foreign, I don't think people would care too much. And I've seen that sentiment expressed about this film, and I think I let that taint my expectations, but luckily from my point of view, this isn't one of those cases. Horror is a genre that doesn't get a lot of great stories. There's great visuals, creative decision making, inspired cinematography, but in ways of genuine, timeless storytelling, it seems to be less and less common. Not entirely, of course, but enough that when something like this comes down the pipeline, it stands out above the rest. But do I think this is the best horror of 2023? No. Is it even the best foreign horror of 2023? No, but I do think that this is a refresher course on gore horror and how to do it tastefully, as well as possession and how to subdue it to be effective rather than big and grossly unsubtle. For gore, it's very easy for the creators to go overboard. I mean, it is fun sometimes, but the way this film uses gore isn't to just shock and squeeze uncomfortability out of the audience, it serves the purpose of weaponizing the effects of this illness. The scene where we first see the rotting body and the scene where they move said body are vile, but it isn't vile for the sake of being vile, because there isn't an excessiveness to it. The actual body is just about the only thing off-putting. The surrounding area has the colour palette of vomit, so it's off-putting as well, but there isn't anything explicitly gory or gross in the set design, which is a perfect decision because the removal of said body keeps that repulsiveness moving whilst not having to upkeep the scenery as grim either, kind of demonstrating how this illness rots everything around it. The problem lies solely with the body, so wherever that goes, the horror goes with it. It would be easy to make the set design just as filthy as the body in this scene to really drive home the illness, possession, and rotting, but I think it would A, distract you from the real horror, and B, ruin the idea of that contained horror, the possession. This restraint is demonstrated throughout this film to point out the situation at hand rather than overindulging. Like when Ruiz and his wife die, the main horror of this scene is the wife character axing herself, and it would have been incredibly easy to make this as bloody and as grisly as possible. But that would simply distract you from the action. The action itself is horrific, it doesn't need the sprinkles to be sweet. There's also the scene of the family dog killing Vicky. There is next to no actual gore, but what little is there is enough because the act itself is again the gut-wrenching aspect of this moment. The film really wants to drive home the viciousness of possession, using blood and body gore as an accent rather than depend on it, which is the easier thing to do. Now this film does turn it up to 11 when necessary, but that restraint shown earlier on is what amplifies the effects of scenes like this one where the mother is seen burrowing into and eating her own child and gets crashed into. I'm choosing not to show a majority of this because, you know, YouTube, but that should tell you enough of how graphic this can get. It's simple but effective imagery that is not for the weak stomachs. Beyond the practicality and effects, the camera work in this film is also quite beautiful. It evokes the situation as all good cinematography should. Techniques aren't there just as select screen choices, they're there to tell the story. Helping the audience to understand the tone and situation without audible assistance is the goal of a cinematographer. Take for instance this conversation. It's still shots with a medium zoom. There's a centricity to the conversation, a focus, a stillness. But then cut to the conversation that takes place just 5 minutes later. The camera work is erratic, handheld, nothing is ever fully in shot. The focus is shifting at a nauseating pace. It's a simple technique, an obvious one even, but you'd be shocked at how many films misuse this technique or even neglect it. And the camera work in general is just nice, especially with what's in focus and what isn't. It shifts so seamlessly to tell the story. I will say though, an unfortunate aspect of the film is the general aesthetic, which is sadly plain. Now obviously this is again going towards the possession's impact, showing how this cruel and gruesome fate can hit the most normal and suburban of circumstances. But I don't think that necessarily means the film has to have an unidentifiable look to it. Most shots in this film could be shots from Succession, which sucks. Especially when films like El Conde and Talk to Me, which both have released this year, have such distinct styles. I would have preferred a brash red and autumn colour palette that follows the aesthetic of the poster, in line with Dario Argento films like Suspiria, but I think the appearance services the story fine enough. I just wish it had a more striking visual. And speaking of the story, I have to commend the writing done by the director Damien Rugner, writer and director of the acclaimed Terrified from 2017, who gives us a perfect elevation of tension. The story starts out with a simple murder, brutal but simple, then elevates to a possessed body, to the panic, to the murder-suicide, to the family drama and murders and so on and so forth, and keeps trucking forward. The tension ever rising to its eventual climax. There doesn't seem to be many lulls in the story. It's quite tight and what you'd expect from a snappy hour and 40-minute runtime. Of course, there are moments where the story takes a moment to breathe, to have a character moment or two, but that never detracts from the horror, only layers it because it's always there. You can constantly sense something's wrong before something goes wrong. The film relies on trusting you as an audience member in being able to be on a level with the film. It doesn't want to outsmart you, it doesn't even want to surprise you, it gives you the breadcrumbs that trail to the horror and begs you to trace them. But more than anything, this film has perfected the art of unease. Not to the level of something like Creep where it's the entire purpose, but it wields the creeping unease so effortlessly around all of its characters, which is a great way to upkeep the traction even when slowing down the action. The film plays with a lot of themes also, most especially the death of God. Religion is a system of belief, and when people stop believing, the deities stop existing. And this film takes place in a world where everybody has stopped believing, because how could they? But when God dies, evil prevails. It's a very interesting aspect to this narrative that has been done before. It's nothing exactly new, but it is added to a new context, which is refreshing in its own right. But in general, I think When Evil Lurks is a horror film that the genre needed right now, something to bring everyone together. This year, especially when compared to the last, has been struggling to pile up great horror films, and yes, there's been standouts, but not enough to quantify it as a great year for horror, original horror especially. But that's just me. Have you seen When Evil Lurks? If so, let me know what you think of it. If not, will you? And whether it's a refreshing but familiar take on body, gore and possession horror or not, as always, keep watching movies.